add as a co-host so he can see this. Okay. Here he is.
Hi, Andy. Am I in the right place?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I didn't get a chance to add your email to the list last night. So I just promoted you to co-host, so you can see all of the tools and everything. It's pretty straightforward on this side. Just follow the program to see who's supposed to be here. Obviously, they should all have access already and should be able to join the webinar before it starts as panelists.
Yeah.
Okay. So for people who are coming in now, welcome to day 3 of CrimCon. This is our 9 a.m. Eastern session on domestic violence. We only have 2 papers in this session, so I anticipate probably being able to get out of here a little bit early if there's another session that you want to jump over to and are okay with joining midstream. I'm going to ask our panelists to keep their talks to about 10 minutes, although with only 2 people, I don't have to be, or 2 papers, I don't have to be really, really strict with that, but just for consistency's sake. We'll shoot for about 10 minutes, and then we'll save all questions for the end. So you should see a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Please feel free to post any questions that you have for any of our presenters in there, and then we'll address those at the end, okay? So I'm going to turn off my video because nobody is here to see me, and turn the floor over to our first paper, Reducing Domestic Violence Recidivism, an exploratory study examining DV offender monitoring and recidivism. Madison, oh, there you go. The floor is yours.
So we'll unmute ourselves. RJ, you want to go ahead?
Excellent. Great. Thank you, and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us this morning. I just want to provide a little preamble to the presentation of this study and just a little background here. So policing is facing a growing societal demand to deliver services more efficiently and effectively. And to that end, we need to be far more strategic in how we leverage our resources. Our traditional organizational responses were personnel and resource intensive. They are no longer sustainable, and often we're not focused on harm reduction as a measure of success. Our programs need to be evidence-based in practice. We need to look at what current academic research exists, if any, and then develop initiatives focused on measurable results. We need to be diligent in our efforts to target, test, and track what we do in order to ensure we are being effective and continue to do so, and be willing to shutter projects that are ineffective, which we historically have been very poor at. The intimate partner violence randomized control trial is one such study. We want to know if this strategic focusing of our efforts will pay dividends in real financial terms and reduce workload later on and the costs associated to it, and in societal terms, more importantly, obviously, in reduced harm to victims. Do our interaction with recidivist intimate partner violent offenders reduce the likelihood of them reoffending? With that, I give you researcher Madison Charman and research assistant Danielle Hutchinson to walk you through our study.
Awesome, thank you. So for our project, our main goal is that Barrie Police is looking to find a frontline-based proactive initiative to reduce IPV recidivism. So essentially, we want our officers to act as a deterrent and to intercept harm before that happens. So that's mainly rooted in rational choice theory. So the cost-benefit analysis of committing a crime. So through enhanced monitoring, ideally we hope that the cost to commit crime is now too risky because we are showing up and we're showing up unpredictably. So we're just in generally more visible. So there has been some enhanced monitoring responses, such as the GPS monitoring, which is mainly through the courts. But we wanted to find a solution that we could do as a service that is sustainable and that we could get our frontline officers to work towards. So the study is ongoing. I will mention that we don't have any results, unfortunately, because we are still going through recruitment and ongoing trial. So ultimately, our question is, does enhanced monitoring of habitual IPV recidivists prevent them from reoffending? So like RJ mentioned, we're doing a randomized controlled trial. So half the participants receive visits, while half receive traditional treatment. So no more and no less than what's originally happening. So we're looking to examine a couple of different outcome measures. So we're looking to see if enhanced monitoring increases or reduces general occurrences with our police service. We're looking to see if we see less domestic related occurrences with those offenders, different breach or violation related occurrences, and if we're seeing an increase in social service uptake. So part of the visits is to create a social service connection. So we'd like to try and measure that and see if that's also having an impact. So ultimately, to see if the program is working, we're looking for significant differences between the pre and post for our control and treatment group, looking at percent changes, case-specific changes, and the treatment group characteristics. So as I mentioned, it is ongoing recruitment. So we began in July 2020, July 1st, and what Danielle and I do is we look at different occurrences that happen. Any that are domestic related will then go through and determine the eligibility of the offender. So our eligibility is pretty strict. We're following the do no harm principle we see in past research where it says new offenders shouldn't be treated with a heavy hand because it can actually backfire. So we're only enrolling people who are quite familiar with us, where interactions with the police don't really come to a shock to them. So that is our eligibility. And then we randomly assign them to treatment and control. So once we do that, we then assign our officers to the weekly check-ins. The check-ins are made to be very informal in nature. We show up, we remind them of their conditions, ask them if they need any connections to resources within the community. And again, just keeping it kind of light and working on maybe repairing some of those relationships and working on our police perception as well. We then document our checks through an app. So the app will ask things such as the offender location. So was it a check at home, at work? Who was there? So things like, were kids there? Was another family member there? And all that. We also have an area for additional notes. So this is where officers can just make some kind of contextual or qualitative observations that they can put in and then send to us so that at the end of the trial, we can look for some of those notes. And it also helps us better the program if it does move forward. And lastly, Danielle and I just keep a master sheet updated. So we have all the files and records to see how things are going before we go into data analysis. So like every real world experiment, there's limitations. We're not working in a controlled environment. And so of course, we're gonna run into some situations. So the first is jurisdictional limitations. So within Barrie and being patrolled by Barrie Police, we have a lot of different police services around us, such as OPP and South Simcoe. And a lot of people bounce around these areas, Barrie, Bradford, Springwater, everywhere. So there's a lot of movement between these jurisdictions for people. So one thing we do have to be careful of is, for example, we had an individual in the study who was then arrested, and a new condition was to reside with a surety that was actually in a different jurisdiction. So at that point, we had to reevaluate and say, this person is no longer, we can no longer realistically check on them with the resources that we have. Even if we believe they're still going to stay in Barrie, we have to take that at face value. Second is rigorous inclusion. So Danielle and I have done this many times where we find someone that we want in the study so bad. But again, we need to respect that this person needs to have frequent contact with police in the past. So there's just not enough of a paper trail or victim participation in a lot of the reports for us to justify putting that person in the study. Third is operational constraints. And this is really it's a real life experiment. Police officers have a very dynamic job and things come up. So when there's different priority calls, of course, the compliance check is going to fall to the bottom of the list. So there has been a few times where we're not able to get to the checks weekly, but we do our best with what we have. And lastly, there's a lack of qualitative information. So when we look to see if there are, for example, reductions in police contact, can we say it was our project? So we have to understand that there can be some external factors that influence people's lawfulness. So what we recommend is, depending on the results of our first study, if it is successful, potentially building this into further research and actually discussing with offenders the impact of our program and the checks. But that is our program in a nutshell. So if anyone has any questions, we have our contact information here, and of course, we'll be around for the Q&A.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Our second paper, intimate partner violence perpetrators, IPV specialists, or crime generalists. Rachel and Kyle, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Just give us one moment.
Mhm.
All right, can you see the presentation screen? Yes?
Yep, you're good.
Wonderful, great. All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us here. It's good to be here. I'm Kyle, and I'll be presenting today with my colleague, Rachel. And our research question is, are IPV perpetrators IPV specialists or crime generalists? So, there we go. All right, so before we can begin, we just need to do some quick linguistic housekeeping. So domestic violence, DV, is an umbrella term used to address both family violence and intimate partner violence. Family violence is any form of abuse, mistreatment, or neglect that a child or adult experiences from a family member. IPV, or intimate partner violence, a bit different, a range of coercive and abusive behaviors used to gain and maintain power and control over a current or former intimate partner. So the intimate partner is the key. An inconsistent terminology and broad use of DV to refer to both family and IPV complicates our collective ability to focus on IPV. So it's just one important point to make. So today we're looking at specialists, which are individuals who commit, only one kind of crime. In our case, that's someone who only commits acts related to or actually are IPV. A generalist is an offender who commits more of a variety of crimes, kind of cafeteria style offender. For our purposes here, a generalist is someone who is a known IPV offender and also commits other types of non-IPV crimes as separate incidents. So our findings. What we have is very exploratory, very initial results from a very tiny sample. So bear with me. We reviewed 24 homicide offenders in Baton Rouge, Louisiana from 2015 to 2018. So that's 24 homicide offenders. And 83% of them were generalists prior to the homicide. So it's possible that this number is actually higher because we relied only on the Louisiana state rap sheets. So if they committed a crime outside of Louisiana, we have no idea. The range of the number of lifetime arrests in Louisiana ranged from 3 to 41 for these generalists, and they were charged with 101 different types of charge in the lifetime of their offending up until the homicide. So these are the top 20 charges that these IPV homicide offenders have been charged with in the past, and also including their homicide charge if they were charged. And the point of this graph, it's very simple, is just to show you kind of the smattering of different charges that these IPV generalists have on their rap sheets. And you'll note that just by looking at the list of the top 20, you only see one that's connected to DV or IPV, and that's, I think it's the 15th most frequent one. 14th, domestic abuse battery. The rest, seemingly could be all non-IPV, but in order to figure that out, we'd have to look more into closer detail, which we did. So clearly more research needs to be done. We are replicating this in 4 jurisdictions, and we will be expanding the pool of the type of offender we're looking at. So it will not just be IPV homicide offenders, but also serious and repeat IPV offenders. In general, we don't know much about IPV offenders in the US. It's really pathetic. There are lots of different reasons for that. Namely, bad or messy data, or actually a lot of places have the data, they just don't know that they're sitting on really useful data, and the research, especially in the US community, is just not really interested in understanding IPV, or if they are, it gets convoluted and mixed up with broader DV terms. Compare that to Australia though. They know so much about IPV-DV, it really puts us to shame. So our friends at the Australian Institute for Criminology have a bunch of interesting papers. One I'd point to in particular, if you go to tiny.cc/AIC123, pretty easy to remember, you'll see that they're also showing signs that are very similar to our research. And how did we do this? Well, really quickly, we looked at homicide reports. We read them, figured out who was an IPV offender. We then got the Louisiana State criminal history for each IPV offender. And these basically came in the form of faxes, so they weren't really structured PDFs, which was frustrating, but we worked with it. And then we also, importantly, met with partners on the ground to discuss not only the homicide and the offender, but also their criminal histories to really, connect the dots and understand what did their criminal history look like, and who were their partners, and kind of how was, what did that look like? And that's how we coded for generalists from all three of those sources of information. So Rachel will take us back to why this matters and kind of how we started and the motivation. So Rachel, are you there?
I am. I'm here.
Hello.
Hi. Can you hear me? Great. Thanks so much, Kyle, and thanks everybody. So this matters for a whole bunch of different reasons. Some of them are things that Kyle's touched on briefly. Intimate partner violence is pervasive, and it's a cross-cutting crime. So what that means is, based on the relationship between a victim and a perpetrator in a police report, it can be intimate partner violence. So while we are often thinking about things like stalking or strangulation or assault, other things are intimate partner violence, arson, fraud, breaking and entering. And we don't always know what is intimate partner violence. And it matters because the motives and the relationships are so complicated when it comes to intimate partner violence that we need to be paying more and better attention to it. So what we know about intimate partner violence is really just a drop in the bucket. Crime reporting doesn't separate this out. So we talk about this as IPV versus DV, and we know that within any jurisdiction, departments are talking about this differently, they are tracking it differently, and they are measuring it differently. So everywhere you go, it's apples and oranges, it's, bananas and pineapples, it's a bunch of fruit salad. So we know they're tracking something, but it doesn't always make sense, and there's no real consistency. So we don't actually know what the impact is. Communities talk about the impact of gun violence, for example, all of the time, and this is something that gets a lot of really precise, detailed study. Whereas with intimate partner violence, we're often just looking at this in kind of groupings of typical types of crimes. And what that does is distract us from paying attention to the individuals that are perpetrating these crimes, right? And the impact that this has on victim survivors, who are often going to be repeat victims, both by their current or former partner or additional current or former partners. So if we can understand what is driving an individual who is continuing to commit acts of violence, and I use violence very generally, knowing that IPV is at times power and control, coercive control, threats and manipulation, and not just physical acts of violence. If we understand who is driving the most serious violence, who is responsible for the most amount of harm, we are able to focus in on them far more specifically and with much more care. So similar to what we heard our colleagues talking about this morning, if you can pay attention to someone who you have concerns about, right, you have a way to directly engage with them, apply a targeted approach, and work to deter or stop them from offending, right? What this means is reducing homicides. It also means reducing arrests, reducing recidivism, reducing victim injury, right? And because we know that not only is IPV so underreported, right? But that it is still trying to be understood as how do we address this from a criminal justice perspective that is both going to be thoughtful to the needs of survivors and partners that are abusive, right? And also help heal communities. We want to be able to apply a strategic response, right? It can't be a one size fits all. So what we know by looking at the types of offender that someone is, whether you are just committing acts of intimate partner violence, or if you're in fact a generalist and you commit other criminal activity, there's a way for us to both counter the experiential effect that both perpetrators and victims learn from how the system typically operates, that oftentimes with intimate partner violence, the consequences will not be swift, they will not be severe, and they may not exist at all. We can put into place more consistent accountability mechanisms. This involves being transparent about what the risks are, right? And also having follow through. And sanctions don't have to be harsh, right? Small sanctions, incremental sanctions, as long as they are consistent and timely, can actually be far more effective in communicating to someone that this deterrence message is one that the partnership on the ground is really going to be standing behind. We also want to lessen the burden on victims. So much of intimate partner violence is victim-centered in a way that isn't focused on what is best for the victim, but how the victim can best serve the criminal justice system's needs. And by shifting that and taking a closer look at the individuals that are actually perpetrating the offenses, focusing on what they need to know to stop, on getting them the help they need, and consistently messaging that this is not about what the victim did or didn't do, but about their behavior. Right? You shift the responsibilities and you make this more of a collective response to wanting to stop intimate partner violence in your community than making this about the victim trying to stop someone. Because as we know, we don't ask robbery victims to stop robberies from happening in the future. We also know that by doing this, you can see sustained reductions in reoffending. So ultimately, what we want to see are communities that are safe, right? And that feel as though when they call out for help, right, they're going to get that help and the help's going to meet their needs. We want that to also look like individuals getting help, right? Reductions in arrests, reductions in incarceration. But in order to do that, right, we have to be able to focus on those individuals that are most at risk at causing harm and ultimately are most at risk of facing harm themselves by being prosecuted and incarcerated. And just to tell you a little bit about who we are, Kyle and I work at the National Network for Safe Communities. We're an action research center based out of John Jay College in New York City. We think of ourselves sometimes as pracademics. We are more or less boots on the ground, strategic advisors. We do really intensive hands-on advising. Prior to COVID, that meant spending a lot of time in person with our sites. During COVID, it means making the best use we can of technology. We look at serious problems around violence and community need. We analyze those problems, and then we work to unpack it and develop a solution by applying a targeted approach that will actually help them reduce violence and increase community safety. We have a portfolio that covers everything from gun violence and group violence to drug markets, to prison violence, to individual chronic offenders, as well as international applications of some of our work. And our work on intimate partner violence primarily focuses on implementing the intimate partner violence intervention, which is a focused deterrence approach to reducing intimate partner violence, as well as looking at how we can increase trust building between law enforcement and communities, broadly and generally, right? As we know, there is a large deficit of trust, and that is a huge burden to our communities and also a real challenge to our law enforcement partners. And in particular, when it comes to intimate partner violence, needing to recognize the ongoing harms and the historic harms that have led to distrust between law enforcement and community. So that's just a little bit about us. Please feel free to reach out to us or ask questions. I think this is actually the fastest presentation we have ever done. And we thank you all so much.
Thank you. We have questions coming in. If anybody has any questions, please feel free to post those in the Q&A box. So our first question from Martine Evans, I'm not sure who this is for, but she writes, how does one organize the criminal justice system in such a way that victims' needs, as Rachel put it, are at the center of what we do, as opposed to wondering how they fit within how the CJS works? I think we can pose that to either group.
I'm happy to start. I mean, I think just having that in your mind is a really good place to start. And then honestly challenging some of our norms. So many of our traditional responses took decades for us to come up with, and are vast improvements in what we did before, but they also still have a lot of unintended harm. And I know that's something that our colleagues mentioned at the start in their paper as well, right? We've come to learn that some of the things that did help or can help a small portion of people often has a really detrimental impact on others. So we have to focus on, both what's in our control, and also realize that systems don't change overnight, right? So instead of looking at how we change the system, what we do with intimate partner violence is we look at how the partners change their approach. So holistically, if you have, for example, your law enforcement partners, including probation and prosecutors and cops, working in conjunction with advocates to look at an incident and say, what do we know about this perpetrator, right? Knowing that advocates are going to put victim needs at the center of their work, right? And help identify and focus for a victim what he, she, or they needs, right? And the other partners have a different responsibility, right? If their responsibility is to seek justice and to do no harm, then how can they do that in the best interests of the community? So what that might mean is being far more transparent and procedurally just in explaining what it means to call the police, what it means to have a protective order, what it means if there's a violation. Just even explaining to victims and perpetrators that a violation of an order of protection means X, Y, and Z. And in this jurisdiction, these are the things that will happen. And this is not about what the victim is doing or saying. This is about a court order, right? That over time, right, with repetition and through word of mouth, because those of us that work in the IPV-DV field know that victims and perpetrators have far more knowledge sometimes. It might not be accurate, but they have far more knowledge about our systems than we give them credit for. We start to shift the thinking, right? And so then there's more trust built between the partners, because an advocate can say, right, I think X is safe and X isn't, and I can't say more than that, right? But an advocate doesn't have confidentiality about the perpetrator. And if they have knowledge about this person's behavior, they can say, these are risk factors we're concerned about, right? I see that he was arrested a number of times and nothing came of that. Us focusing on the victim right now should be about his or her safety, right? That should not be about moving the case. The case itself comes from investigation, right? Collecting evidence and being able to support whatever it is the law enforcement partners need to do. So doing it both in collaboration, but taking really respectful and solid ownership of the different roles that we have through the criminal justice system to help make it feel like it is less complicated and less impenetrable, particularly now when there's even more confusing communication happening, when people can't get face-to-face time as easily with an advocate, with a prosecutor, with a victim services coordinator.
All right, thank you. Another question's come in. I'm not sure who this group is, who this question is for specifically, so I guess we can open it to both groups. Did you all find out if COVID had an effect on IPV? Was there a change in the IPV approaches that have been reported?
We can certainly speak to that. North of the 49th parallel, again, from a Canadian perspective and specifically in Ontario, we actually presented earlier with respect to the COVID effect on intimate partner violence. And just again, from specifically within Barrie, we actually found a dip, a reduction in the intimate partner violence reported to us. And the cautionary note right off the top is the iceberg effect here. Again, the police, we measure what we can, that which we have numbers for. So again, the likelihood that it's ongoing and potentially increasing, quite possible, and freely admit that. And in the particular study we looked at, we actually reached out to our local shelter and again, to source them to get a better and more robust picture. And they actually saw a dip as well. Again, the caveat to that being, okay, but everyone's been locked in their home, so perhaps their numbers are actually suppressed because of that. So the quick answer is we actually don't know, but the numbers, the reported numbers were reduced.
Wow, that's surprising. Thank you. Do we have any other questions for any of our panelists? I've learned over the last 2 days that when there's a lull in questions and then I start to wrap up, that's when questions start to come rushing in.
So I to fill that gap, I had a question, but I can't type in the Q&A because of the role that I've got on the call.
Oh, please go ahead.
So I'm just wondering about your randomization strategy for the Barrie team. This is a difficult bit of work to be to do, and randomization is almost always one of the hardest things about an RCT. So I'm just wondering what your randomization strategy was.
Yeah, so we actually are picking from a sample of 50. So we randomized a sequence of random control. And then as occurrences happen, by time is okay, so that's our 5th person, they're allocated as treatment. That's our 6th person, they're allocated as treatment. So that's kind of how we've done it. So it's just a rolling basis, and then we have that allocation already. So it's just the time that they come in and kind of the number that they end up being is where they're placed.
Thank you. Presumably the officers making the reports don't know that. So there's no way they could.
Right, they don't. And not all of our officers are involved in the project. There's only a few that are doing the checks. So there is a few of them that a lot of them don't necessarily know the operation specifically.
It's really interesting to see, because you've not talked about mentioned a university partner. It's really interesting to see a police agency doing an RCT like this entirely in-house, and particularly a relatively small agency having the capability to do that is really interesting to see. So thank you.
All right. So no more questions have come into the Q&A. So I'm going to there we go. Yes, the unknown and spurious factors is playing a part of IPV, but is in a black hole due to COVID. This is scary. Yeah. Yes. Thank you for your comment. Yeah, I have a feeling that once that the day that comes that we're all looking for when this is over, I think everybody expects like a lot of research, a lot of stuff to come out about what was actually happening behind closed doors during the past however many months. We're in lockdown, in various stages of lockdown. So thank you all again for coming out to CrimCon this morning. Thanks to all our panelists for your fantastic work. Thank you everybody in attendance, and enjoy the rest of your conference. If you plan on sticking around on this stream, I have to reboot the webinar for recording purposes. So this will be back up live at about 10 a.m. Thank you. And then Matt, if you want to stick around just to see if you have any questions about anything.
Yeah, so I think that went okay. As long as you, if you've added me to the list for the
Yeah,
2 p.m.
Yeah,
like
I'm going to
1
use
p.m. Sorry.
time. Yeah, I'm going to use the time I have now to do that. Sorry, it just everything got away from me last night.
No, that's fine. There's like it's a huge endeavor for a very small group of people. So, so yeah, I wouldn't. It's yeah, don't worry about that. I'll let you go then. Unless I think everything's fine. I think as long as I've got that access, I can come on, and I'll do that at 10 to the hour.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much.
Okay, no problem. See you later. Oh, you've got 3 more questions now.
Oh.
Oh no, they're just saying thank you and fine, it's the same person. It's fine.
Yeah.
Bad timing. Okay, fine. Right. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot, everybody.